Hi, I'm Katherine. I'm a designer at Yarnspirations.com. Thank you so much for joining me today. What we're working on today, it's the second tutorial supporting the Let's Stitch Together knit along, and we will be sewing together some of the mitered squares that we've been making. So I have provided an assembly diagram that correlates to the palette that I've selected from my own stash, and you can find that at Yarnspirations.com, and as well it should be linked through all our social media channels. Now, with that said, the reason that I've made this afghan a seamed afghan rather than a join as you go is I do appreciate that people are working with all sorts of different color palettes out of their stashes and maybe have more colors and different quantities. So by seaming them together at the end, you have a bit more creative control as to what the final product looks like. And what I would encourage everybody to do is to play with layouts. Take over your kitchen or dining room table for an afternoon if you have the free time, and just play with laying out the squares different ways. If you're unsure of how your layout is looking, or if you're particularly proud of how your layout is looking, I definitely encourage you to take a picture and post it to any of our social media channels using the hashtag Let's Stitch Together. And I'm sure people in the community, as well as us designers, will be more than happy to provide you with feedback and praise, whatever's desired or required. Anyway, it could be a really fun chance for us to see what everybody else has worked up through this very difficult time. In any event, as I mentioned, there is an assembly diagram. And how I would recommend tackling that diagram is by first sewing short seams between the squares to form strips, and to then sew those individual strips together. So there is a little diagram, and I've included a directional arrow here just for reference for this video. Because what I do suggest is that when you're sewing your strips together, you should be very conscious of the direction that you're sewing in. It doesn't matter what direction you start with, it is important to be consistent throughout your seaming. If you're seaming some of your seams top to bottom and some bottom to top, it can distort your fabric a little bit. So just be mindful of that. I often label my seamed afghans with like sticky notes with pins through them with an arrow on it so that I remember the next time I pick it up, okay, I'm sewing this way. But I digress. If you've never seamed together mitered squares before, it's a little bit different than seaming together, say, garter stitch squares, because 50% of your edges here are garter ridges and 50% are cast on edges. And so the great thing about garter stitch is that one garter knit stitch equals 2 rows. So when you're picking up along the edge and sewing your cast on edge to your garter ridge edge, since 2 rows make a ridge essentially, and 2 rows equal a stitch, you basically just pick up 1 stitch for every ridge. And it's easy to know where the next ridge you should be picking up is because each ridge is an alternate color. So it makes it pretty straightforward. And if you are a little bit meticulous too, you can be mindful of how many you're picking up, just if you want to ensure accuracy and to make sure you're working exactly from corner to corner. So to get to this middle stitch will take you 24 stitches, and then that'll be your 25th. So if you'd like to keep count, that can often be a handy tool. All right, so I like to start, I'm sorry, I'm jostling these around a lot. I like to start with my squares right side to right side. And so that is how I will orient them, and I'll fold them so they're right side to right side. And hopefully it's more clear if I use a pink tail. And this is the reason I leave tails on my mitered squares, is so that I can use them to seam squares together later. So it does eliminate some of the weaving in at the end. And what you're going to want to do for the length of the seam is it's pretty easy to distinguish the front of your first garter ridge. And you'll also then work through the front of your first stitch, and you're working in ladder stitch. And so you're going to progress that way all the way down. And I know I just worked into a hot pink one or a shocking pink one on this side, so I know I need to do a light raspberry one here. So working in the fronts of each of those stitches, again, back and forth in a ladder stitch. Picking up a front loop, another front loop, and pulling through. Front loop, front loop. So just back and forth like that all the way down. All right, I'm gonna keep working this seam and I'll be back in a moment. Okay, so I'm almost done the full length of the seam and I'm just still working as I've established, picking up front loops on either side. And as I'm working, I'm making sure my yarn is pulled taut, but not tight. All right. So I'm going to give it a little tug. Make sure it's got a good tension. And here we go. We've sewn these two together, and as you can see, it's a relatively inconspicuous seam. And so that's how you're going to sew your mitered squares together. And your ends are, once you've fastened off and everything, your ends are going to be pretty easy to hide. You'll just want to weave them in through the back of your garter rows and try to weave them through a corresponding color. So I, for something like this, would just go back and forth, weaving that in so it's pretty inconspicuous. Again, making sure that you're maintaining a nice tension to kind of bury that. Okay, and so that is how you are going to join together all of your mitered squares. Thank you so much for joining me for this knit along, and I hope that you are all staying safe. And please make sure that you share your creations to social media so that we can all get together and appreciate one another's work.